Good morning. It's very good to be with you, distinguished participants, organizers. Thank you very much for the invitation. Apologies in advance, as my presentation will try to pack 3 presentations in one. And therefore, it will probably be a bit superficial and a bit chaotic. But hopefully, I will try to address the issue at hand. Talking about the Eastern Mediterranean in a multipolar world, I guess I'll be speaking more about the multipolar world. And I thought that it would be significant, important to sort of define what that means. And at least from a realist perspective, from the perspective of the realist school of international relations theory, a multipolar international system is a structure of global power distribution in which multiple states or group of states hold significant power and influence, and no single state or pair of states dominates. So we have multiple great powers that interact and compete, balancing each other out to prevent anyone from achieving hegemony. Multipolar systems, according to John Mearsheimer, are more unstable than bipolar systems, as we know, and according to Waltz, an international system in which 3 or more great powers have split into 2 alliances remains a multipolar system structurally distinct from a bipolar system, a system in which no third power is able to challenge the top 2. Why am I saying all these? Because if we are to assume that we're living in a multipolar world, it's important to be able to know what that should look like. And I'm not entirely certain that we are living in a multipolar world, a fully fledged multipolar world yet. Some key characteristics of multipolar international systems, as we've seen also maybe a century ago and so forth, are multiple centers of power, dynamic alliances that are shifting, very fluid, balance of power politics, states constantly trying to balance each other out, complexity and unpredictability, many powerful actors, and reduced likelihood of dominance. I would add here transactionalism and a reduced importance of normative frameworks. Some of these features exist today. I wouldn't say all of them. So, if we take a brief look, just some indicative data. Obviously, that's just a couple of types of data here that might help us look at the structure of the international system from a power perspective, from the perspective of economies and military power, based on 2024 data. This demonstrates that we have 2 superpowers, among many other great powers, obviously, that have an aggregate power that is much more than all the rest. So you will see a huge discrepancy, a huge gap rather, between the second and the third powers, especially in terms of economy. And you will see, between Russia and China, there is small difference in military power, but I don't think that's really the case given the position that Russia finds itself in at this point in time. So I do think that China is potentially more powerful militarily than Russia as well. So what we have is 2 superpowers, basically, trying to navigate an increasingly multipolar world. So it could be argued, based on what I just mentioned, that there are 2 concurrent dynamics in the international system. On the one hand, we have the diffusion of power from the west to the east and south, and therefore the distancing from the unipolar or non-polar structure of the international system as was described, let's say, 15, 20 years ago. One could potentially speak of a unimultipolar international system, as some literature has described, but I believe the data and realities on the ground cannot support such an argument. On the other hand, we clearly have 2 great powers. Whether they are still superpowers is a question. I think they are at the top of the power distribution, not least with great distance from the rest, as I said before, including Russia, which we tend to see as a superpower, but in reality, it's not of the same magnitude as the US or China. This is important because the significance of a pole is not defined by a single capability or power component. The aggregate power, for example, sectors like the economy, military, resources, technology, demography, and so on, should be taken into account altogether. I would therefore make the case that we're currently living in a multipolar bipolar international system where both sort of trends or dynamics coexist, and we haven't still settled in what the international order and the structure of the international system of the day after will look like. We're in a transitional phase, and states are trying to navigate and also claim their place in the international system. So whether we do live in a multipolar, bipolar, or multipolar world, or any other sort of international system structure, there should be no doubt that the transition away from unipolarity, which I would say, ran from 1991 after the Cold War and maybe the late 2000s, has had significant implications for global and regional geopolitics. Some of those are the relative retreat of American hegemony, and most importantly, the growing unwillingness of Washington for unilateral action, at least as we've seen it in the early 2000s and in the 1990s, and boots on the ground entanglements in conflicts abroad. Many people talk about the withdrawal of American power, but I don't see the US disappearing or having disappeared from the Middle East. They're still there. Right? They haven't withdrawn entirely, obviously. They've retreated somewhat, but I think the most important feature in this whole discussion is this unwillingness to play the same role as they used to, because what happened as a result was huge costs on multiple levels. The second one is the increase of real or perceived power vacuums because of this change. The third one, the encouragement of third states, mainly middle and great powers, to pursue their own agendas, often going against the interests of traditional allies. One very important example for this region is Turkey, and how Turkey has many times taken decisions that have gone against the interests of traditional NATO allies. This is not the first time, obviously, but it's been happening more and more. Four, the rise of regions as more significant levels of analysis and spaces of security management, development, and integration, i.e. Regionalism. We've seen efforts for such projects in the Eastern Mediterranean as well. Now, since the early 2000s, when it comes to the Eastern Mediterranean, three main factors have contributed to the construction, let's say, of the Eastern Mediterranean as a distinct geopolitical space. Because up to that time, the Eastern Mediterranean was not understood or perceived as a distinct geopolitical space like we were talking, maybe we used to talk about the Middle East or still are. So up to that point, the Eastern Mediterranean was mostly viewed as a gateway or a bridge to other more important areas like the Middle East or even over India or the Southeast Asia during the times of British colonies and so on. So I would say that these three factors, these main factors, have contributed in changing the nature of the Eastern Mediterranean, or how it has been perceived. First, systemic changes, as I mentioned, globally, the transition towards multipolarity, and regionally, various kinds of events like the Arab Spring, the rise of the Islamic states, migration flows, and so on. The second one, the growing assertiveness of regional powers because of the power vacuums that were created as a result of the diffusion of power. We have Turkey, the Emirates, Israel, Saudi Arabia being some of those powers in the broader region, as well as extra-regional actors playing a bigger role in the area like Russia, especially since 2015, France, China, and so on. So this led to new security concerns because as new countries become more active and more assertive, other countries start to develop, threat perceptions, security concerns, as well as different patterns of enmity and amity, because this tends to impact how states interact with each other. So alliances change as well, cooperation schemes change as well, and so on. And the third factor when it comes to the East Med is the discovery of hydrocarbons, especially of Israel first, then Cyprus, and then Egypt. This came with a big promise, but that promise was never really fulfilled, or not until, not until now at least, and not when it comes to the Eastern Mediterranean as a whole. We have seen separate projects that have not taken a regional form so far. One of the most important developments was the transformation of Turkish foreign policy and the adoption of a revisionist approach, in my opinion, leading to deteriorated relations with, starting in 2010, with Israel, then Syria, the Emirates, Egypt, Cyprus, and Greece, obviously already having their own issues with Turkey. Common security concerns vis-à-vis Turkey and cooperation prospects due to hydrocarbons gave rise to a bipolar structure in the East Med. On the one hand, having Turkey, and on the other hand, having Israel, Cyprus, Greece, Egypt. This is not an alliance. This is just a partnership with some common concerns about Turkey because of how Turkish foreign policy changed. So because of deteriorated relations with Turkey and Ankara's closer relationship with Russia, especially after 2016, the US had to invest in other partners in the East Med. The fact that the US has somewhat retreated and is unwilling to engage in traditional ways does not mean that it does not care or does not have interests in certain regions. The broader area of the East Med has been one of the regions that Washington is attempting to an offshore balancing strategy. So finding partners in the area to share the weight of accomplishing their objectives. As such, the US has supported the trilateral schemes of cooperation in the East Med between Cyprus, Greece, Israel, Egypt, and so on, and championed the Abraham Accords between Israel and Arab states in 2020. And it has done so to deal with the malign influences, according to the national security strategy of the US, of China, Russia, and Iran, among others. So in other words, the post-Cold War superpower, the United States, has been trying to manage the rise of the rest and the retreat of American hegemony, which finds itself in a survival mode, I would say, including in the Eastern Mediterranean. And I'm closing with these final words. Since 2020, because of domestic economic and political problems, as well as international isolation, Turkey embarked on an effort to deconstruct and replace the Eastern Mediterranean security architecture by trying to normalize relations with states such as the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Greece, Egypt, and Israel. The latter obviously failed after Gaza. So because of the conflict-producing dynamics of multipolar-like realities, regional and global hotspots have been consuming most of the energy, both of the US and international society, especially we're talking about hotspots like Ukraine, Gaza, Syria, India, Pakistan, and so on. Therefore, the Eastern Mediterranean, under the second administration of Donald Trump, has thus far not been high on the agenda, and I would say naturally so. The web of developments in the area is very complex, and the future of regional relations depends largely on the outcome of certain conflicts, particularly Gaza and Syria, as these affect Israel-Syria, Israel-Arab worlds, Israel-Turkey relations, and beyond. In this context, just a small note, the Cyprus problem and the Greek-Turkish dispute might have to wait, as other much more important conflicts still go on. Thank you very much for your patience.